What's going on, all of my healthcare brothers and sisters? I hope that you are having a wonderful day. We are continuing on with our ATI TEAS journey, and we're going to start looking at English and language usage. And we're going to start off with the conventions of the English language. Let's get started. So as always, we begin by looking at the objectives when it comes to our particular portions of the exam. When it comes to conventions of English, there is a total of 12 items that are scored out of the total 33 that will be on the test. Objectives that are going to be covered are using conventions of standard English spelling, conventions of standard English punctuation, and use of correct sentence structures. So we begin with our spelling rules. There are many common spelling rules that are taught, including I before E, except after C, drop the final E, double the final consonant, and change the final Y to an I. Let's take a closer look at each one of these. We begin with I before E rule. One of the most common spelling rules is I before E, except after C. This rule can help you when you're trying to decide between two similar spellings. So for example, are you going to spell it R-E-C-E-I-V-E or R-E-C-I-E-V-E? Well, as we know, I before E, except after C, we know that the correct spelling is going to be R-E-C-E-I-V-E because we have a C. That changes that I before E, so the E comes before an I. Exceptions to this rule would include certain words like weird, height, and foreign. Certain words, the E is going to come before the I, but traditionally, I comes before E except after C. Next, we have drop the final E. Another very common spelling rule is that we drop the final E when you're using a suffix that begins with a vowel. So that's I-A-E-I-O-U. So for example, the word love becomes loving, L-O-V-I-N-G. Because, as we know, the suffix ing begins with a vowel. There are exceptions that you would need to keep the E when you're using a suffix that begins with a consonant. So, for example, the word amaze becomes amazement. That E is still there because, as we know, that suffix ment begins with a consonant and not a vowel. So, doubling the final consonant. You need to double the final consonant before adding a suffix that begins with a vowel if that final syllable is stressed. So for example, the word begin becomes beginning. That N is stressed in between begin and that ing. So you need to add that additional consonant. However, if the final syllable is not stressed, then you do not have to look at doubling the final consonant. So for example, the word despair becomes despairing. Do you hear the difference? Beginning, despairing. It's very different. So if that final consonant is stressed, you add the double consonant, and if it's not, you take it away. And lastly, we have change the final Y to an I. If the word ends in Y and you need to add a suffix that begins with a vowel, then you're going to change the Y to an I. So for example, the word beauty becomes beautiful. We remove the Y at the end of beauty and make it an I so that our suffix full, F-U-L, makes sense. If the word ends in Y, but the suffix that you are going to add begins with a consonant, not a vowel, then you do not need to change the Y. So for example, the word enjoy becomes enjoyment, right? Ment, M-E-N-T, begins with a vowel, that's your suffix, so there's no reason to change the Y to an I. And lastly, you do not need to change the Y to an I if the suffix that you are adding begins with I. You don't need to have two I's, right? So for example, the word cry and the suffix ing, I-N-G, would become crying, C-R-Y-I-N-G. There is already an I at the beginning of your suffix, so there's no reason to change your Y to an I. So let's now move on to the rules when it comes to plurals. There are also lots of rules when it comes to plurals. To make a word plural, you're going to typically add S to the end of the word, right? So for example, the word cat becomes cats. We just simply add an S. However, if the word ends in S, X, Z, CH, or SH, you will need to add ES to make it plural. So for example, the word fox ends in X. In order to make it plural, you need to add ES, and that fox becomes foxes. Sometimes you need to change the spelling of a word entirely to make it plural. So for example, the word child becomes children. Children is plural for child. The suffix ends in ren, R-E-N, so we completely have to change that word in order to make it plural. There are also irregular plurals that do not follow any of these rules, and you just kind of have to memorize them. So for example, person becomes people. Sometimes you're going to need to identify homophones and homographs. Homophones are words that are pronounced the same, but they have different meanings, even if they are spelled differently. So for example, the words there, and there. There, T-H-E-Y apostrophe R-E is they are. Their, T-H-E-I-R is a possessive, meaning it's theirs. And there, T-H-E-R-E is a place. Homographs are words that are spelled the same but have different meanings. So for example, the word bass can refer to a type of fish, or bass, spelled exactly the same, can be a low-pitched range of notes in music. You're going to be taking the ATI-TEAS, and this is going to be difficult. You're going to have to identify which spelling and meaning is used based on the context of the sentence. So for example, question, my dad went to sea to catch some bass. In this sentence, the word bass is referring to a type of fish. So it would use the spelling B-A-S-S, but it's referring to a type of fish and not that low-pitched sound of music. Next, we have commas. These are our favorites, right? Commas are one of the most commonly used pieces of punctuation, and there are several rules that we need to identify in order to use them. One of the rules is the Oxford comma, which is used before the word and in a list of items that include 3 or more. So for example, I went to the store and bought milk, comma, eggs, comma, and bread. There's 3 items. If you don't use the Oxford comma, it will change the meaning of the sentence altogether. So for example, I went to the store and bought milk, comma, eggs, and bread. In this sentence, it sounds like you bought milk and eggs together and then bought bread separately. Here are some more common rules when it comes to the use of a comma. Number 1 is you place a comma between a conjunction and a compound sentence. So for example, I have a big test tomorrow, comma, but I'm not worried. Your but is your conjunction between those 2 compound sentences. Number 2 is we place a comma around an introductory phrase or clause. So for example, after school, comma, that's our introductory phrase, I am going to the store. Okay. Number 3, place a comma before or after dependent phrases and clauses and around non-essential elements that interrupt the main clause of a sentence. So for example, the average world temperature, comma, however, comma, has continued to rise significantly. However is that interruption between those 2 sentences. So you want to place commas around that word. And then lastly, number 4. You want to place commas between 2 or more coordinate adjectives describing the same noun. So for example, it was a dark, windy night. Dark and windy are your adjectives, which is why you place a comma in between dark and windy. So we're going to talk about indirect and direct quotations, starting with indirect quotations. An indirect quotation is when you report or paraphrase what someone else has said without using their exact words. So for example, if I said, my mom said I need to clean my room, that would be an indirect quotation. If, however, I said my mom said you need to clean your room, that would be a direct quotation. The writer has to cite the source regardless if we're using an indirect or a direct quotation. So direct quotations are when we use the exact words that somebody else has said. When you use a direct quotation, it is really important that you use proper punctuation. So for example, Dr. King said, comma, then you use your quotations, I have a dream. That's specifically what Dr. King said, and we use the comma to denote what Dr. King said versus the actual phrase that was said. It's really important, again, to cite the source of a direct quotation. If the writer uses somebody else's words without quotation marks, that practice is called plagiarism and will get you in a lot of trouble when you start writing your papers for school. So how are we going to improve our grammar? We're going to begin by looking at sentence punctuation patterns. This is one of the most common ways, and the best way to improve your grammar is to become familiar with common sentence patterns. In order to understand sentence types, it would be helpful to know independent and dependent clauses. An independent clause is a clause that can stand alone as a complete sentence. It's very independent. It doesn't need nobody else to make it, better. Whereas a dependent clause is a clause that cannot stand alone as a sentence and has to be attached by an independent clause in order to make sense. So here is a list of common sentence patterns. We have simple, compound, and complex sentences. Starting with our simple sentence, this sentence has one independent clause and no dependent clauses. It stands on its own. So for example, life itself is the most wonderful fairy tale. That was by Hans Christian Andersen. Compound sentences have two or more independent clauses, but no independent clause. So for example, it may seem difficult at first, but everything is difficult at first, right? That is an example of a compound sentence. And lastly, our complex sentence has one independent clause and at least one dependent clause. This is when we start seeing those sentences that require independent clauses to make sense. So for example, until the lion learns to write, comma, every story will glorify the hunter. So the sentence, until the lion learns to write, if that is the only thing the sentence say, it doesn't make any sense. But that independent clause, every story will glorify the hunter, adds to that dependent clause. It doesn't make sense. This is actually an African proverb that I absolutely love and adore. So as we've been learning, punctuation is key when it comes to making sense with our sentences. And the ATI TEAS is going to also include things besides the comma, of course, is apostrophes and end marks. So an apostrophe is a punctuation mark that is used in several different types of ways. One way of using it is to indicate possession. So for example, the cat's, C-A-T''S, toy is under the bed. In this sentence, the apostrophe is indicating that that toy belongs to that cat. Another use of apostrophe is to create contractions. A contraction is a shortened version of a word or a phrase. So for example, I apostrophe am, is going to the store. In this sentence, the apostrophe is taking place of the letter A and connecting the word I am. So I am becomes I'm, the apostrophe replaces the A, and that becomes a contraction. End marks are just as important because it really changes the way that the sentence is said. End marks are punctuation marks that are placed at the end of the sentence. And the three most common types of end marks you're going to see is the period, the question mark, and the exclamation point. The period is used to end a declarative sentence, which is a sentence that makes a statement. The question mark is used to end an interrogative sentence, which is a sentence that's usually asking a question. And lastly, an exclamation point is used to end an exclamatory sentence, which is a sentence that expresses strong emotions. So let's use the phrase or the sentence, I am done. So I am done with a period at the end of it is just a declarative sentence. I am done, period. If we add a question mark to the end of that, it changes the way the sentence is said. I am done, right? It's more of a question than it is a declarative statement. If we add an exclamation mark at the end of that sentence, I am done. I'm excited. I'm finally finished, right? That's how you're going to feel when you finally finish the ATI TEAS and you pass it, right? So that is how those end marks change the way a sentence makes sense. So now we're going to take a closer look at correcting sentence structures by using clauses, phrase, and sentence types. A clause is a group of related words that contains a subject and a verb. There are two different types of clauses, and we've talked about them before. Independent clauses and dependent clauses. An independent clause is a clause that can stand alone as a complete sentence. So for example, I was tired after working all day. Case, end of point, completely understandable. Whereas a dependent clause is a clause that cannot stand alone as a sentence and it has to be attached to some kind of independent clause. So for example, I was tired. You were tired of what? You were tired of working, you wanted to go to sleep. What does that mean, right? It has to have some kind of independent clause to make sense. A phrase is a group of related words that do not contain a subject or a verb. So for example, under the bed, right? There are three different types of sentences. We talked about them before: simple, complex, and compound. This is so important. It's included on two different pieces of the objectives that are part of the ATI. So really, again, make sure that you understand the differences of them, because you will have multiple questions that correspond to how these sentence types occur within the ATIs. So there are many different types of parts of speech. Specifically, there's 8 that's going to be on the ATIs that you need to know. Nouns, pronouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs, prepositions, conjunctions, and interjections. So we begin with verbs. Verbs are words that express action or a state of being. So for example, the verb in the sentence, the cat slept on the mat, the verb would be slept. That is what the cat is doing. Nouns are words that represent people, places, or things, or ideas. So for example, the noun in the sentence, the cat slept on the mat, the nouns would be the cat and the mat. The cat is the person, and the mat is the thing. Pronouns are words that take the place of nouns. So for example, the pronoun in the sentence, she has many chocolates in her pocket, is she. So instead of specifically listing somebody's name or that particular person, they use the pronoun she to replace that. And then lastly, adjectives are words that describe or modify nouns or pronouns. So for example, the adjective in the sentence, a little boy fell into the river. Little is the adjective. It is describing or modifying that noun or pronoun. Prepositions are words that show relationships between other words in a sentence. Common prepositions that you're going to see are before, since, inside, and after. So for example, the preposition in the sentence, you can play video games after you study, is after, right? That is the preposition. You cannot play video games until you study. Maybe you could use that as a strategy if you like video games for studying ATIs. Conjunctions are words that are joined together by phrases or clauses. Common conjunctions are and, so, and but. Those are the common conjunctions that you're going to see. So for example, the conjunction in the sentence, I'm studying English and she's studying math, your conjunction is going to be the word and, because it is joining those two phrases together. I am studying English and she is studying math. And then lastly, we have interjections. These are words that express emotion and are usually placed at the beginning of a sentence. So for example, ouch and wow, those are both interjections. Now we have subjects, predicates, and other sentence parts. There's a lot going on in a sentence, right? The subject of a sentence is the noun or pronoun that is doing the verb. So for example, in the sentence, the cat slept on the mat, the subject of that sentence is the cat, right? The cat is what's doing the verb. The predicate in a sentence or clause is what modifies that subject. It can be either a verb or a verb phrase. So for example, in the sentence, John walked faster than James, John is the subject and walked faster than James is the predicate, right? It is the sentence or clause that is modifying the subject, John. Now we have modifiers and complement. So modifiers are words, phrases, or clauses that provide additional information about the subject. So for example, in the sentence, John, who is taller than James, walked faster than him. That phrase, who is taller than James, is the modifier because it's giving us additional information about John, and it lets us know why he was faster than James. Complement describes words that are needed to complete the meaning of a sentence. So for example, in the sentence, the cat is black, that word black is a complement because it completes the meaning of the sentence. We know that the cat is black. There's also a chance you're going to see direct and indirect objects on the test. A direct object is a noun or pronoun that receives the action of the verb. So for example, in the sentence, Jack caught a fish is the direct object because it is the thing that is being acted upon by the verb. We know that Jack is the noun, that is the person, and caught is our verb. A fish is going to be that direct object. That's how you kind of break that sentence down. An indirect object is a noun or pronoun that receives the action of the verb indirectly. So an example of this would be, I gave my brother a book. My brother is the indirect object as he is the one receiving the verb, gave, that indirectly, right? I am the topic, I am the person, gave is my verb. My brother is that indirect object, and that book, again, is our noun. It's a person, place, or thing. And lastly, we have sentence diagramming. One of the ways to visually see the parts of a sentence is through sentence diagramming. So you'll see this is, there's going to be like a line that's drawn underneath each word of a sentence, and it's going to be labeled specifically on what parts of the speech it is referring to. So for example, the sentence, the children in the preschool nap after lunch, would be diagrammed as follows. Children is our subject. In is the preposition. The is the article. Preschool is the adjective. Classroom is our object. Nap is our verb. It's what they're doing. They're napping. After is our preposition. And lunch is the object of the preposition. I hope that this video is helpful in understanding the English and language usage conventions of standard English. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please leave them down below. I love answering your comments and questions. As always, head over to nursecheung.com where there's additional resources there to help you pass your ATI TEAS. And of course, until next time, I'll see you in the next video. Bye!